Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we're examining one of the most haunting murder cases in American history. A quiet family home, 8 victims, and a killer who disappeared into the night without ever being identified.
It really is a case that leaves this permanent physical and psychological scar on an entire town. I mean, human nature kind of conditions us to fear the monsters lurking out in the dark woods.
Right, like the unknown figures hiding in an alleyway somewhere.
Exactly. But the reality of this case proves that the absolute most terrifying monsters are the ones waiting quietly inside our own homes.
I mean, imagine you were walking around your house tonight, checking the locks, turning off the lights, and you feel completely secure. Well, the horror of the Villisca Axe Murders, which took place in June of 1912, is that the lock on the door didn't keep the danger out.
No, it trapped the family inside with it. It is the ultimate locked room paradox.
Yeah, a home secured from the inside, a family asleep, an unimaginably brutal crime, and a killer who just vanishes into thin air, leaving behind nothing but these baffling, ritualistic clues.
Which raises the exact question we're going to explore today. How does a crime of this staggering magnitude, with a house practically overflowing with physical evidence, remain completely unsolved for more than a century?
So to even begin to unravel that failure, we really have to establish the environment. We have to strip away the assumptions we hold about the past.
Right, because when you hear the phrase, small town Iowa in 1912, what image immediately comes to mind?
I think most of us listening probably picture a dusty, isolated little farming village, a dirt road, a general store, maybe a horse and buggy tied to a post.
Just a place where nothing happens.
Exactly, the kind of place where strangers stand out immediately and everybody knows everybody else's business.
And that assumption is exactly what hindered the early investigation, because Villisca was not a sleepy backwater. It was a booming, prosperous, incredibly active commercial hub.
Oh, really? So not isolated at all?
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
The population was roughly 2,500 people, which was substantial for that region. But its real significance came from its infrastructure. Villisca sat directly on the main line of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad.
Ah, so it was an artery.
A massive one.
Mm-hmm.
We are talking about dozens of passenger and freight trains passing through and stopping at the Villisca Depot every single day.
Wow. So instead of a quiet village, it's actually more accurate to think of Villisca in 1912 as like a modern-day international airport terminal.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
You have this constant rushing flow of transient movement.
Yeah.
Traveling salesmen, railroad laborers, performers, drifters, all just flowing in and out of the community at all hours of the day and night.
Yes, the town had hotels, restaurants, a theater, manufacturing plants. It was fundamentally connected to the broader world. It was a town of constant motion.
And sitting squarely in the middle of this thriving, bustling community was the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, who went by JB, was 43 years old.
And he was an aggressive, highly successful businessman. He managed and owned the local John Deere implement dealership, so he was a real pillar of the community.
Right. And his wife, Sarah, was 39, deeply involved in the local Presbyterian church. They had 4 children, 11-year-old Herman, 10-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, and 5-year-old Paul.
By all accounts, this is your quintessential, upwardly mobile American family of the era. And what makes the tragedy so profound is how painfully mundane their final day was.
Sunday, June 9, 1912, Sarah Moore had spent weeks coordinating the church's annual Children's Day program, and the entire family attended.
And the event wrapped up around 9:30 at night. Because it was a celebratory occasion, the Moore's 10-year-old daughter, Catherine, asked if 2 of her friends could come stay the night.
Those friends were 12-year-old Lena and 8-year-old Ina Stillinger, so the Moores and the Stillinger girls walked home together from the church.
It was a cool, dark evening. They arrived at the Moore house on East 2nd Street somewhere between 9:45 and 10 o'clock at night.
They walked inside, locked the doors behind them, and began their evening routines. Now, I want to pause here and have you, the listener, really visualize the layout of this house.
Yeah, because the architecture plays a critical role in the vulnerability of these victims.
Exactly. In a modern family home, we usually group bedrooms together, right? Often upstairs or in a specific wing for security and proximity. But the Moore house had a layout that unknowingly isolated its occupants.
Right. The guest room, where the two young Stillinger girls were sleeping, was located on the first floor directly off the parlor.
Meanwhile, Josiah, Sarah, and their 4 children all went to sleep upstairs on the second floor.
And situated directly above the Moore's second-floor bedrooms was an unfinished, cramped attic.
Just a dark, empty space.
Exactly. And based on the timeline, the layout of the home, and the complete lack of any forced entry, investigators would later deduce a chilling sequence of events.
The killer didn't break in while the family was sleeping, did they?
No. The killer was almost certainly already inside the house before the family even walked home from church.
So they slipped in while the house was empty during the Children's Day program.
Yes. They crept up the stairs, climbed into that unfinished attic, and simply waited in the dark.
I mean, the psychological discipline that requires is just staggering to think about. Or perhaps it's sheer derangement.
It's incredibly predatory.
Picture being in a sweltering Iowa attic in early June, the heat radiating off the roof, and the killer sits there in the pitch black for hours.
Just listening through the wooden floorboards.
Yeah, as a family of 6, plus 2 little girls, come home, listening to them talk, laugh, brush their teeth, say their prayers, and slowly drift off to sleep. Knowing exactly what you were about to do to them, it is sickening.
It demonstrates a highly predatory patience. The killer waited until well after midnight, ensuring the house was in its deepest state of sleep before descending from the attic.
And, the discovery of this crime the following morning is practically a masterclass in building dread. It doesn't start with a scream or a gruesome discovery by a passerby.
No, it begins with a simple, unnerving absence of sound.
Right. Mary Peckham, who lived directly next door to the Moores, woke up to start her Monday morning chores. By 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, she looks over at the Moore property and realizes it is entirely too quiet.
And for a farming-adjacent family with 4 young children in 1912, the house should have been a hive of activity by sunrise. Josiah wasn't out doing his morning chores.
There were no children playing in the yard. The house was dead silent.
So Mary Peckham senses something is wrong. She goes over and knocks on the door, but there's no answer. She tries the doorknob, but it's locked tight.
She goes back home, lets a little time pass, but the anxiety is just gnawing at her. She eventually calls Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, and asks him to come check on the family.
Ross arrives, bangs on the front door, shouts for his brother, still nothing. So he tries to look through the windows to see if anyone is sick or hurt inside.
But he can't see inside. Every single curtain on the ground floor has been tightly drawn shut.
And in the rooms that lacked curtains, someone had physically pinned up items of clothing over the glass to completely block the view from the outside.
Which is a massive anomaly in this era. You don't board up your windows on a Monday morning.
Exactly. So Ross Moore finally uses his own spare key to unlock the front door. He steps into the parlor. He calls out.
And he opens the door to the first floor guest bedroom, the one right off the parlor. And in the dim light, he sees blood on the bed sheets.
He immediately backs out, tells Mary Peckham to call the town marshal, Hank Horton, and waits on the porch.
When Marshal Horton arrives and conducts a full sweep of the house, the true, unimaginable scope of the massacre is revealed.
All 8 people inside the house have been bludgeoned to death in their beds. Josiah, Sarah, and the 4 more children upstairs, and the 2 Stillinger girls downstairs.
And the weapon used was left right there at the scene. It was Josiah Moore's own axe found in the downstairs guest room.
The forensic reality of the crime scene is difficult to comprehend. The attacker used both the blunt end and the sharp blade of the axe.
And the swings were just brutally violent, right?
They were executed with such savage, unrestrained violence that the upswing of the axe literally left deep gouge marks carved into the wooden ceiling above the beds.
But wait, if the axe was found downstairs with the Stillinger girls, does that give us a sequence of the attacks?
It does. It tells investigators that the killer began the assault upstairs. They moved through the second floor, murdering the parents and the 4 sleeping children first.
So once the upstairs was silent, the killer carried the axe downstairs to the guest room to murder Lena and Ina Stillinger last.
Yes. And tragically, the forensic evidence suggested that 12-year-old Lena was the only victim who woke up.
Oh, wow.
She was found positioned differently than the others, and she had a defensive wound on her arm, suggesting she tried to fight back in the dark before being overpowered.
It's horrific. But while the brutality is shocking, the elements that elevate the Villisca case from a tragic mass murder into a century-long baffling mystery are the killer's actions after the violence ended.
The staging of the crime scene.
Yeah, the post-defense behavior is what truly confounds behavioral analysts. The killer didn't drop the weapon and flee in a panic.
No, they lingered in the house for an extended period, engaging in a series of highly ritualistic, almost incomprehensible actions.
Let's walk through this staging because it defies all logic. First, the killer went room to room and methodically covered every single mirror in the house with pieces of cloth or clothing.
Additionally, they took bed linens, and in some cases, items of the victim's own clothing, and draped them over the severely traumatized faces of all 8 victims.
Then we get to the kitchen and the downstairs areas. The killer took a 2-pound slab of raw, uncooked bacon from the icebox and placed it next to the murder weapon in the guest room.
They also left a washpan full of bloody water, presumably where they attempted to wash their hands.
And perhaps most bizarrely, investigators found a plate of uneaten food sitting on the kitchen table.
It's so strange. The killer took the time to prepare or arrange a meal in a house filled with 8 bodies, but then left without eating it.
After completing all these tasks, covering the mirrors, draping the faces, placing the bacon, leaving the bloody water, and setting the table, the killer locked the house from the inside.
Right. They exited through the front door and then used the Moore's own keys to lock the front door from the outside, taking those keys with them into the night.
It's the quintessential locked room mystery. You have a house sealed up tight, hiding a slaughterhouse inside.
And looking at this through a modern lens, you have a house absolutely packed with behavioral clues.
Exactly. You have a weapon left behind, you have items manipulated by the killer's bad hands, you have a basin of water. You'd think, even with the limited forensics of 1912, this is a solvable case.
You would think so.
Yeah.
But the aftermath is arguably one of the worst instances of crime scene contamination in the history of American law enforcement.
I feel like contamination is an understatement here. The moment word got out, and remember, in a bustling town of 2,500 people, a rumor like this spreads like wildfire panic, morbid curiosity, and sheer hysteria completely overtook Villisca.
The local police force, which consisted of a town marshal and a few deputies, simply lost control of the perimeter.
The local coroner arrives, and from what the records show, he doesn't even bother to take detailed, systematic notes on the exact condition, temperature, or positioning of the bodies before they are moved.
And it gets much worse. Marshal Hank Horton somehow allowed the general public inside the house.
Wait, the general public?
Yes. Historical estimates suggest that anywhere from 75 to 100 curious townspeople physically walked through the Moore home while the bodies were still lying in their beds.
I just want to pause and process that. 100 people walking through a mass murder scene.
They trampled through the blood on the floorboards. They moved items around to get a better look.
Unbelievable.
There are even contemporary reports stating that some of these sightseers actually picked up and handled the murder weapon, the bloody axe itself, before the Iowa National Guard finally arrived around noon to secure the property.
So any footprints left in the mud outside the windows, any latent fingerprints inside the house, any subtle trace evidence regarding the killer's entry point, exit route, or movements, completely obliterated within hours by the townspeople themselves.
Exactly. And when a federal criminologist later arrived from the Department of Justice to try and impose some scientific order on the chaos, he suggested an uncomfortable theory.
What was that?
He told the town that based on the evidence, the killer might be someone local.
Oh, I'm sure that went over well.
It didn't. The citizens of Villisca were so enraged and insulted by the implication that a member of their own community could commit such an act, they labeled him a drunk and literally chased him out of town.
They obliterate the physical evidence, and then they physically run the expert out of town for suggesting a theory they don't like.
It's just wild.
When you destroy objective physical evidence like that, it creates a massive vacuum. And what fills a vacuum in a terrified community? Speculation, paranoia, and wild theories.
Because the town has no facts left to analyze, so they turn on each other and they start looking outward for monsters.
Exactly. The lack of physical evidence forced the subsequent investigations to rely almost entirely on behavioral patterns, circumstantial evidence, and perceived motives.
Over the years, the theories regarding the killer's identity fractured into 3 distinct camps. the transient serial killer, the local hitman, and the deranged religious fanatic.
Let's start by examining the transient theory, often referred to in historical circles as the man from the train theory.
And honestly, this theory makes a lot of logical sense when you remember our earlier analogy about Villisca functioning like a modern airport terminal.
Right. The idea that an anonymous drifter could hop off a freight train in the middle of the night, commit an unspeakable act of violence, and be hundreds of miles away in another state by dawn, that was a very real, very terrifying prospect for these rural communities.
And the initial focus of this theory landed squarely on a transient named Andy Sawyer.
Who was he?
Sawyer was a strange, erratic laborer who coincidentally secured a job with a Burlington Railroad crew working right there in Villisca on the very morning the bodies were discovered.
And from the accounts of his fellow railroad workers, Sawyer's behavior was incredibly suspicious. He was apparently obsessed with discussing the murders.
Right, he reportedly slept in his clothes, and he kept his own axe right next to him at all times.
The most damning report came from his crew foreman, who claimed that Sawyer was rubbing his head one day, suddenly jumped up, made violent chopping motions with his axe, and muttered something about cutting people's heads off.
When you hear those details, it sounds like law enforcement had found their man. But this is the frustrating reality of the Villisca case. Things that look like a sure bet often disintegrate under scrutiny.
Right, because Sawyer was brought in and intensely interrogated, but it turned out he had an ironclad, documented alibi.
He'd been arrested for vagrancy by police in a completely different town, Osceola, Iowa, at 11 o'clock on the night of the murders.
It was physically impossible for him to have been inside the Moore house, waiting in the attic. So Andy Sawyer is cleared.
But clearing Sawyer doesn't invalidate the overarching theory of a transient killer, because the investigators soon discovered another man, a man named Henry Lee Moore.
Now, wait a minute. Henry Lee Moore. Was this a family member seeking some sort of horrific revenge on Josiah?
You would naturally assume so, given the last name, but no. In a grim, strange coincidence, Henry Lee Moore had absolutely no relation to Josiah Moore or his family.
Really? Just a coincidence.
Yeah, but what he did have was a record as a highly prolific convicted serial killer.
Let's explore his profile. What was he convicted of?
In the months immediately preceding and following the Villisca tragedy, there was a sudden, shocking string of family axe murders scattered across the Midwest and the western United States.
Like copycat crimes. Or the same guy.
We are talking about highly similar crimes in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Monmouth, Illinois, Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paola, Kansas. Henry Lee Moore was eventually apprehended and convicted of murdering his own mother and grandmother with an axe in Missouri.
When you lay the details of Henry Lee Moore's known crimes next to the Villisca crime scene, the similarities are just chilling. He explicitly targeted entire families.
And he always attacked late at night while the victims were asleep.
Right. And he never brought a weapon with him. He always relied on finding the victim's own household axe to commit the murders.
And he was a known transient who used the extensive rail network to move rapidly from town to town. If you plot his known locations and the unsolved Midwestern axe murders on a map, Villisca sits right in the geographical center.
Wow. So from the perspective of behavioral and geographic profiling, Henry Lee Moore is an incredibly compelling candidate. The modus operandi matches the Villisca case almost flawlessly.
It really does. But returning to our core problem, because the Villisca crime scene was so thoroughly compromised by the townspeople, there was absolutely no physical evidence left that could definitively link him to the Moore house.
No fingerprints, no trace evidence.
None. It remains a highly plausible theory, but legally an unprovable one.
And beyond the lack of evidence, there is a psychological barrier for the town of Villisca. A random act of violence committed by a nameless drifter is deeply terrifying because it implies a total lack of control.
Exactly. It means you cannot predict it and you cannot present it.
So a large faction of the town began to focus their suspicion much closer to home, looking for a motive that made sense in their localized world. That brings us to the local revenge or hitman theory.
And the central figure in this theory is a man named Frank Jones.
Who is Frank Jones?
Frank Jones was a prominent Iowa state senator, a wealthy local businessman, and, crucially, a bitter, very public rival of Josiah Moore.
To understand the depth of their animosity, you really have to look at their history. Years prior, Josiah Moore had actually worked for Frank Jones at Jones's hardware and implement store.
And Josiah was his top salesman, incredibly effective at his job. But in 1907, Josiah made a move that shattered their relationship.
He left Jones's employment to start his own competing business.
And he didn't just leave, he managed to take the highly lucrative John Deere franchise contract away from Jones and brought it to his own new store.
In a rural agricultural economy in 1912, the John Deere contract is the lifeblood of an implement business. That is a massive financial and reputational blow.
It really is. To put it in modern terms, it's the equivalent of a top tech executive leaving a company to start a rival firm and taking the absolute biggest multi-million-dollar client account with them.
So the bad blood between Jones and Moore was legendary in Villisca. By 1910, local lore stated that they hated each other so much they refused to even walk on the same side of the street.
And this intense, highly visible animosity is exactly what drew the attention of an investigator named James Newton Wilkerson.
Wilkerson was an operative for the Burns National Detective Agency.
Right. Now, 4 years after the murders, in 1916, Wilkerson stepped forward with an explosive, highly detailed claim.
He publicly alleged that State Senator Frank Jones had hired a man named William Mansfield, who was a known labor organizer with a violent background, to completely wipe out the Moore family.
And the motive Wilkerson presented to the public wasn't just about the loss of the John Deere tractors. He added a scandalous, deeply personal element.
Wilkerson claimed that Josiah Moore was having a secret, illicit affair with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law.
So Wilkerson is alleging a motive of ultimate, devastating financial and personal revenge.
The fallout from Wilkerson's allegations was an absolute political circus that tore the state of Iowa apart. It's important to understand the tactics of the Burns Detective Agency during this era. They were known for aggressive, often theatrical methods.
Wilkerson didn't just quietly present his findings to a local prosecutor. He launched a massive, statewide public relations campaign.
He formed an organization called the Iowa Protective Association, raised substantial public funds, and held massive rallies where he essentially accused Senator Jones of operating like a mafia boss.
It is a textbook example of mass hysteria and populism. Wilkerson figures out how to weaponize a community's unresolved grief and terror for his own professional gain.
He whipped the public into an absolute frenzy. When a grand jury convened, looked objectively at the evidence, and refused to indict the supposed hitman, William Mansfield, largely because Mansfield had a solid alibi, Wilkerson did not back down.
No, he doubled down. He accused the grand jury of being entirely corrupt and bought off by Jones.
He publicly attacked the governor of Iowa. He attacked the state legislature. He attacked the newspapers.
Frank Jones actually sued Wilkerson for libel in a desperate attempt to clear his name. And in a shocking turn of events, Jones lost the civil suit.
He lost.
He did lose the civil suit, but we have to contextualize that. Losing a civil libel suit in a highly charged, emotional atmosphere where the jury is already swept up in public hysteria is very different from being proven guilty of orchestrating a mass murder in a criminal court.
That makes sense.
To settle the matter, a subsequent massive grand jury investigation was convened in 1917. This grand jury heard from over 100 witnesses provided directly by Wilkerson.
And after all that testimony, they completely clear Frank Jones of any involvement whatsoever.
The state eventually fired Wilkerson, and his credibility completely crumbled shortly after when he was caught embezzling funds from his own protective association.
It's what you might call detective envy. He prioritized the spectacle, his own fame, and the narrative over the actual truth. Wilkerson turned a profound tragedy into a political weapon.
But while the town was tearing itself apart over the wealthy senator and the rogue detective, another suspect was waiting in the wings.
Perhaps the strangest, most unnerving character in this entire saga, Reverend George Kelly.
Reverend Kelly introduces a profoundly dark psychological dimension to this case. Kelly was a traveling minister, originally from England.
And he had a highly troubled, documented history, right?
He did. He was known among congregations as an eccentric, deeply nervous, and unstable man. More disturbingly, he had a known history as a sexual predator and a peeping Tom.
He had been caught requesting young women to pose nude for him, and he had previously spent time confined in a mental hospital.
And he was right there in Villisca on the night of the murders. He actually attended the Children's Day church program that Sarah Moore coordinated.
He sat in the pews, watching the Moore family and the Stillinger girls, and then he abruptly left town on a very early morning train the next day, hours before Mary Peckham ever noticed the house was quiet.
But it was his behavior in the weeks and months after the murders that truly made him a primary suspect. Kelly became entirely obsessed with the case.
He sent rambling, bizarre, heavily religious letters to investigators, to the newspapers, and even to the victims' extended families.
He reportedly sent a bloody shirt to a dry cleaner shortly after the murders. He even returned to Villisca weeks later, specifically posing as a tourist, just to get a tour of the crime scene.
This escalating obsession culminated in 1917 when Kelly submitted a highly detailed confession to the police. Let's dissect this confession.
Right, so Kelly claimed that he suffered from severe insomnia on the night of June 9. He went for a walk to clear his head, and he ended up standing outside the Moore house, peeking through the windows.
He claimed he stood in the dark and watched the young Stillinger girls getting ready for bed.
And then, according to his confession, a voice directly from God spoke to him, commanding him to suffer the children to come unto me.
He confessed to finding the axe, entering the house, and committing the murders in a state of religious and sexual frenzy.
On the surface, when a suspect provides a detailed confession to a crime, it seems like case closed. The state immediately indicted him, and he was put on trial.
But as investigators, we have to look critically at the context in which that confession was obtained.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have to push back hard on taking Reverend Keller's word at face value here. We understand today that false confessions are incredibly common, particularly from individuals who suffer from profound mental health issues or cognitive vulnerabilities.
They really are.
And if we look at the interrogation tactics used by law enforcement in 1917, they were notoriously brutal. They employed what was commonly called the third degree.
Yes, the third degree involved intense physical and psychological coercion.
Right. They kept this tiny, mentally unstable man awake for hours, perhaps days on end. They badgered him. They likely fed him details of the crime scene and demanded he repeat them back.
The police and the entire state desperately needed a win. They needed someone to pay for this crime.
And Reverend Kelly, with his delusions and his desire to please authority figures, was a vulnerable, highly suggestible target.
Your skepticism is entirely justified, and remarkably, it's the exact same skepticism the juries possessed at the time. Kelly was tried twice for the murders.
The state prosecution argued that he acted on his horrific hallucinations, but his defense team systematically dismantled the confession.
They argued it was entirely coerced by exhausted, desperate detectives. Furthermore, they pointed out a physical discrepancy.
What was the discrepancy?
Well, Kelly was a man of very slight physical build. The defense argued he simply did not possess the sustained, horrific, upper body strength required to wield an axe with the force necessary to kill 8 people and leave deep gouge marks in the ceiling joists.
The physical mechanics just didn't align with his stature.
Exactly. The first trial ended in a hung jury. In the second trial, after hearing the arguments about the coerced confession, it took the jury only 5 hours of deliberation to acquit him completely.
So Reverend Kelly walks free. State Senator Frank Jones is cleared by a grand jury. The transient serial killer theory, Henry Lee Moore, remains a ghost without physical evidence.
The investigation hits an absolute brick wall, and the case of the Villisca Axe murders goes permanently cold.
But the story of the Moore house doesn't end in the courtroom. In fact, for a large segment of the population, the mystery simply mutated.
Yes, when the realm of criminal justice completely fails to provide answers, the realm of the paranormal eagerly steps in.
It is a very common, observable cultural phenomenon. A site of profound, unresolved trauma becomes a blank canvas upon which a culture projects its collective fears.
Over the decades, the Moore house passed through several different owners. It deteriorated steadily, becoming an eyesore until it was very nearly condemned by the city.
But in 1994, a local man named Darwin Lynn purchased the property. He undertook a meticulous, highly detailed restoration project to return the house exactly to how it looked in the summer of 1912.
He stripped away the modern electricity. He removed the indoor plumbing. He furnished it with period-accurate pieces. He essentially built a time capsule.
And then he opened it up to the public for daytime tours and, incredibly, for overnight stays.
Since then, the Villisca Axe Murder House has become a massive, legendary fixture within the online true crime and paranormal research communities. It consistently ranks on lists of the most haunted locations in the United States.
The sheer volume of paranormal reports originating from the house is extensive. Visitors and previous tenants claim to have experienced a wide array of phenomena.
People report seeing the shadowy, distinct figure of a man holding an axe standing at the foot of the bed in the children's rooms.
They report hearing the faint, disembodied sounds of children crying or whispering in the empty parlors.
There are numerous accounts of closet doors unlatching and opening on their own, items of clothing being thrown across the room, and an overwhelming, physically suffocating feeling of dread, specifically when individuals attempt to climb the narrow stairs and enter the attic where the killer supposedly waited.
The influence of media has only amplified this. The Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures crew conducted a highly publicized lockdown investigation there.
Right, and during their episode, they captured an audio recording, an EVP or electronic voice phenomenon.
When played back, it sounds distinctly like a male voice whispering, "I killed 6 kids."
Now, whether you firmly believe in the supernatural or you are a staunch skeptic, you have to acknowledge the psychological weight of the space.
Standing in that dark, restored house, knowing the agonizing history of what happened in those exact rooms, it inevitably plays tricks on the human mind. The trauma of the event feels practically baked into the wooden floorboards.
It represents a fascinating intersection of true history and modern mythology. People seek ghosts because ghosts offer a strange sort of narrative closure that the law could not provide.
But if we pull back from the paranormal speculation and look at this cold case through the rigorous clinical lens of modern criminal profiling and forensic science, the tragedy of Villisca takes on a completely different kind of frustration.
Because if this crime happened today, with the evidence left at the scene, it would be solved in a week.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the forensic data today, the first thing you'd ask is, how do we sequence the killer's DNA? Think about the forensic goldmine the killer left behind.
Let's analyze the physical evidence with modern scientific capabilities. First, the murder weapon, the axe. It was wiped clean of visible blood, but we know today that wiping a weapon with a cloth does not remove microscopic biological material.
Today, forensic technicians would meticulously swab the wooden handle and the metal blade. They would be looking for touch DNA skin cells sloughed off by the sheer friction of swinging the axe.
They would look for microscopic trace blood evidence caught in the grain of the wood. Within days, we would have a complete genetic profile of the person holding that weapon.
Furthermore, consider the staging. The killer used cloth to cover the mirrors and draped linens over the victims' faces. They had to physically handle and manipulate those fabrics extensively.
That manipulation guarantees the transfer of evidence. Skin cells, sweat, perhaps even hair follicles or unique clothing fibers from the killer's own garments transferred onto the Moore family's linens.
Modern trace evidence analysis would build a biological and physical profile of the suspect almost instantly.
And then there's the food. This is the part that drives modern investigators crazy.
The 2-pound slab of bacon left next to the axe. The killer handled raw, greasy meat.
They left a washpan full of bloody water where they presumably rinsed their hands. They left a plate of uneaten food on the kitchen table.
Today, a forensic lab could pull distinct DNA profiles from the rim of the water pan, from the paper wrapper of the bacon, from the surface of the plate.
You can use chemical reagents to pull latent fingerprints off the front doorknob or off the victim's metal keys that the killer used to lock the house from the outside.
It highlights just how devastating and permanent the contamination of the crime scene was. When those 75 to 100 townspeople walked through the house, they didn't just ruin a few footprints in the dust.
No, they fundamentally destroyed the only objective truth the crime scene held.
It reminds me of a modern-day cybersecurity breach. Imagine a major corporation's secure servers are hacked. And instead of immediately locking down the network, preserving the logs, and calling in forensic IT experts, the management decides to let every single employee log in.
Oh, wow. Yeah, just letting everyone click around the infected files, open the malware, and delete lines of code just to see what happened.
Exactly. By the time the actual cybersecurity experts arrive to investigate, the original source code of the hack, the digital fingerprints and routing paths of the hacker are completely overwritten and lost forever.
That is exactly what the townspeople of Villisca did to the Moore house. That is an exceptional and accurate analogy.
Without that physical source code, we are forced to rely on behavioral profiling to evaluate those three main theories we discussed.
And when we apply modern behavioral analysis to the killer's actions, specifically the intricate staging of the scene, the idea of Frank Jones hiring a professional hitman completely falls apart.
Right. If I am a professional assassin hired by a wealthy state senator to eliminate a business rival, my entire objective is speed, efficiency, and discretion.
I go in, I execute the target, and I get out immediately to establish my alibi and collect my payment.
I certainly don't rely on finding a weapon at the scene. The fact that the killer used the family's axe shows a complete lack of professional preparation.
Exactly. A contracted professional brings their own reliable tools. Furthermore, a professional hitman does not linger for hours in a house filled with 8 corpses.
They do not take the time to methodically seek out and cover every single mirror in the house. They don't drape linens over the victims' faces.
They don't leave slabs of bacon or prepare a plate of food. These actions serve absolutely no practical, tactical purpose in avoiding detection or fulfilling a contract killing.
So if it wasn't a professional hit, what does that specific bizarre behavior suggest? Let's talk about the psychology of undoing. Why cover the mirrors and the faces?
In the field of behavioral profiling, covering the victim's faces is a classic example of undoing. It strongly suggests that the offender possesses a psychological inability to look at the horrific reality of what they have just done.
It implies a process of depersonalization. The killer's brain is attempting to reject the reality of the violence, treating the victims as inanimate objects rather than human beings to mitigate their own psychological break.
It's an act of dissociation.
Yes. And covering mirrors is frequently associated with a deep, crushing sense of internal shame or severe delusion.
The killer either cannot bear to see their own reflection after committing the act, or they are operating under a psychotic, supernatural belief.
Like thinking that the souls of the victims might escape through the mirrors or that spirits are watching them.
Right. This evidence points entirely away from cold, rational calculation. It points directly toward a deeply disorganized, psychologically driven, emotionally volatile offender.
Which brings us right back to either the deranged itinerant preacher, Reverend Kelly, or a roaming, impulsive serial killer descending into madness like Henry Lee Moore.
That is the most sound conclusion based on the behavioral evidence. Kelly's documented history of sexual deviance and intense religious delusions perfectly aligns with the bizarre, disorganized staging of the scene.
The suffer the children mandate he claimed to hear fits the profile of an offender driven by overwhelming psychotic compulsions.
Conversely, Henry Lee Moore's established pattern of nighttime family annihilations using household axes also fits the mechanical execution of the crime perfectly.
The bizarre staging could simply be the unique, twisted psychological signature of a transient killer who is rapidly losing touch with reality.
We will likely never know for certain which of them it was, or if it was someone else entirely.
But while historians and true crime enthusiasts continue to debate the identity of the killer, I think it's vital that we look at the collateral damage of this unsolved mystery. Because the axe didn't just destroy Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls.
No, that axe fractured the entire community.
The sociological and psychological impact on Villisca and the surrounding rural communities across the Midwest was profound, immediate, and lasting.
You have to place yourself in the mindset of the era. This was a time when people literally did not lock their doors at night.
The concept of a malicious intruder silently invading the sacred sanctity of the family home and committing mass murder while everyone slept was simply unfathomable. It didn't happen.
After June 10th, 1912, the hardware stores in Villisca and neighboring towns sold out of every single lock, bolt, and latch they had in stock.
The loss of innocence was absolute. People became terrified of the dark. We have accounts of families abandoning their own farmhouses to group together in one single house to sleep, feeling there was safety in numbers.
Men stayed awake all night, sitting on their front porches with loaded shotguns across their laps, waiting for a shadow to move in the yard.
They physically nailed their wooden windows shut from the inside, enduring the sweltering heat of the Iowa summer, just to feel a fraction of security.
And that pervasive, suffocating fear corroded the social fabric of the town. Because the killer was never identified or caught, suspicion became a permanent resident of Villisca.
Neighbors began looking at neighbors, wondering if the person they bought groceries from or sat next to in church was secretly the monster.
The Wilkerson Crusade capitalized on this, politicizing the town's grief. It turned a shared tragedy into a bitter, partisan war that ruined reputations, bankrupted local businesses, and destroyed the fundamental trust that held the community together.
It is a stark historical reminder of how early media manipulation, the spread of populism, and a desperate hunger for a scapegoat can prioritize a public circus over actual justice. The town wanted an answer so badly they were willing to destroy each other to get it.
The ultimate legacy of the Villisca Axe Murders is that it shattered the foundational innocence of rural America. Sociologists widely consider it the specific event that ended the era of unlocked doors in the Midwest.
The crime tapped into our most primal, deeply ingrained evolutionary fears.
The locked room nature of the massacre, the undeniable, terrifying fact that the killer was already inside the house, waiting patiently in the dark, sweltering attic while the family sat downstairs reading or talking. It violates the one single place on earth we are supposed to be truly safe.
It proves that the very walls and locks we build to keep the danger out can just as easily trap us inside with it. And I think that is why the Villisca case continues to fascinate and horrify us today.
It is a crime scene permanently frozen in time, preserving a mystery that outlives generations. It acts as a dark, silent monument to the unknown.
It forces us to confront an incredibly uncomfortable reality. Sometimes, despite all our investigations, our logic, and our modern theories, the darkness wins.
The monster simply unlocks the front door, walks out into the night, and disappears forever.
And it leaves us with a truly chilling paradox to ponder as we conclude our exploration today. The town of Villisca was so completely terrified of an outside monster that it tore itself apart.
The citizens pointed fingers at their own prominent leaders, they destroyed lifelong friendships, and they shattered the trust of their community.
Yet today, more than a century later, that same town has turned that very nightmare into a permanent tourist attraction.
They built a museum in Josiah Moore's old implement store. They hold commemorative events at the local theater.
They sell tickets to sleep in the very rooms where children were bludgeoned. They are commercializing the exact tragedy that destroyed their community's innocence in the first place.
It is a haunting reflection on how time eventually transforms sheer terror into entertainment.
Next time, we return to Australia to examine one of the nation's greatest missing persons cases, the disappearance of the Beaumont children whose trip to the beach forever changed Australian parenting.